Hey everybody, this is the presentation on visual rhetoric from Purdue OWL. This was done back in 2014, but I think all of the information is still really relevant. So let's get to it. We have some of the main points that will be discussed is the definition of visual rhetoric and why it's important today, and visual rhetoric and text, color, graphics, and overall design. So this will be really helpful for those of you who have chosen a very visual medium for your recast projects. So what is visual rhetoric? It's the use of anything from the use of images as argument, the arrangements of elements that are on the page, or the use of typography, the types of fonts and such. Sometimes visual rhetoric is used to describe the analysis of existing images and visuals. So this presentation doesn't really cover each of these areas in depth. However, it will cover some of the most common problems in visual rhetoric that are encountered by student writers, and how you can improve your knowledge of visual rhetoric to create multimedia, multimodal, and visual-based projects, not products. So what is visual rhetoric? This term falls under a term that's known more widely as visual literacy. You may have heard of that before. And that's generally split into these three categories: visual thinking, visual learning, and visual communication, or visual rhetoric. Though clearly visual thinking and visual learning must occur in order to communicate visually. The diagram on this slide illustrates these ideas. So as you can see, with visual thinking, we have things like metaphoric thinking, visualization, imagery. Then we get into things like left brain and right brain and mental nodes. For visual learning, we're talking about the design of materials, reading pictures, and research on learning. But in visual communication or visual rhetoric, we're talking about art, media, visual rhetoric, aesthetics, and these are all various ways of the cognitive processes of the brain during communication and learning. So I think this is a really cool, what is it called? A graphic diagram that kind of splits things into different parts. So why is it important? Since visual thinking is a major part of cognitive processes, and since our world is dominated by visuals in communication, especially nowadays where we do so much visually and digitally, I think, that really ramped up since 2020, because we've come to rely on these visual representations and such. So we need to be able to analyze and produce documents that create or that use visual rhetoric. So, we need to be able to read and dissect and produce effective visuals, right? You want your visuals to be effective. So we're going to look at things like text elements, how type functions, and choosing appropriate fonts, how to deal with headlines versus body text, text in the web, the use of color, the use of visuals and graphics. Clip art is no longer really that big of a thing, but things like illustrations and diagrams, graphs, photographs, and other manipulated images, as well as overall page design. Those things are really important because they do affect the audience visually. How things are placed upon a page, or within the visual area, how things are placed really do affect the audience. So it's important to be mindful of how things are designed. So let's talk about how type functions. Text is so highly visual. that its visual nature and power are often overlooked. However, it's important that when you're designing, you understand how type functions and what it does before making decisions about the use of a certain font. Each typeface has a personality, whether it's formal or informal, and each can achieve a certain effect. So it's important to remember that not all fonts are appropriate for every situation, simply because of the nature of their personality. So the consequences of font choices, what's appropriate. So let's take a look at some different font personalities. You see 4 examples here, right? So we can see, you can look at the font choices and focus on the font without being distracted by the meaning of the text. We can see different personalities and level of formality emerging simply with these 4 choices. So if you look at 1 and 4, these are what are called sans serif fonts, meaning they're plain and they don't have any decorations or finishing strokes on the letters. There's nothing fancy about them. They're very plain, right? Fonts 2 and 3, this looks a bit like a Times New Roman. You notice how they have all these fancy little edges. Those are serifs. They're serif fonts, right? We have all these little decorative elements that make it look a little bit more formal, a little bit more fancy. They have additional strokes or feet on the letters. And so we need to consider the personalities of each of these fonts and the situations in which they would be appropriate. Serif fonts tend to be more formal, while sans serif fonts are less formal. So in a few moments, we'll look at some examples of when these fonts would be appropriate or not. So let's look at choosing appropriate fonts. It's important to choose the font according to rhetorical situations and not simply because it looks cool or because it looks pretty. So you as a designer should think about the context of the publication or project that you're doing, as well as the purpose behind your project and which fonts will improve the ethos, right? Your credibility or the credibility of your publication, right? The ethos of it. Furthermore, you need to consider the cultural and visual associations of a particular font face and choose fonts that are appropriate for your document. Not all fonts will fit the document because the document might have one purpose. And an improper font choice may distract from or contradict the document's intent. I mean, if you think about how we ask you to have in MLA format, right? MLA format, the typical font is Times New Roman or something similar, something that is a little bit more formal and is easier to read, right? So you have to think about those sorts of things going into your project, right? If your project is focusing on a certain audience, you may choose a different type of font than you normally would. So it really depends. So let's take a look at some font choices here in this first example. There are 4 separate phrases in the same font as in the example that we saw earlier with those 4 fonts. But instead of seeing only the font, you can consider the choice of font in context with the message that's being conveyed. So in these first 2 phrases, operating instructions and Dear Mrs. Smith, they don't at first glance appear to have any cultural associations. This is intentional because the fonts are nondescript and commonly used, right? These are fonts that we see. This is, I think, probably like an Arial font, and this is like Times New Roman. And these are ones that we typically see in our day-to-day interactions, right? However, let's look at these other 2. We have medieval history. You notice the font looks like what we think our idea of medieval script may be, right? This kind of looks medieval. Ooh, so let's use medieval history, right? And then this font for Bigfoot Captured is similar to what we see in supermarket tabloids, National Enquirer. any of those publications where they have these sensational titles, right? It's loud, it's bold, and it's indicating an announcement of incredible sensational news. So if you look through magazines or at billboard advertisements and other documents, you can see how fonts are used to get a feel for the cultural associations that we have with those various fonts. So let's take a look at another example. So this shows same fonts, but different phrases, and the cultural associations are ignored. So the font choices may not be the most appropriate considering the context of the phrases, right? For example, in deepest sympathy, in this font, it may seem kind of cold and impersonal in this typeface, right? If it were in a sympathy card, it would just be kind of like, okay, yeah, thanks. The font choice for Lafayette Teen Center may be appropriate in some contexts, unless the context is promoting this publication that's aimed at teenagers. This work doesn't grab attention or evoke excitement, whereas a different font or more youthful in appearance might work best. It may be more effective in getting the message out. Font choices for Chemistry Lab Report and Museum of Natural History are also inappropriate given their cultural associations. Seeing Chemistry Lab Report in this kind of, I don't know, it's kind of Celtic, medieval looking type of font is kind of weird. And Museum of Natural History, well, unless they're advertising Bigfoot, perhaps this isn't the most appropriate use of typeface for their message. So let's look at headline versus body text. You know, when you're in your document, whether you're using Microsoft Word or Google Docs to do your typing, it's important to choose a font according to your rhetorical situation and not simply because it's cool looking or pretty. You need your type to be readable, especially if it's like a formal academic essay, right? So you as a designer should think about the context of the publication or project, as well as the purpose behind the project and which fonts will improve the ethos, right? So you have to consider the cultural and visual associations. So how text functions, the type of text dictates the font choice. We have emphasis and attention, and then we have the information. And we also want there to be sustained readability. So what I mean by that, and we'll see this in the next slide, is that we have a headline here, right? It's big, it's bigger than the rest, so it grabs our attention. And then we have the same type of font, but its body text is a bit smaller in size. So we have lunch menu, that's the title or the headline. The font choice seems appropriate for a lunch menu. It's eye-catching, it evokes a sense of formality. Maybe you're at a fancy restaurant, right? And the font is isolated to that one phrase. However, when you use that same font in the body of your text, it does something, right? Something happens with your eye and something happens with your brain, and you kind of just stop reading, right? Because it's all this, and it's like your brain is kind of like, okay, this is just too much for me to take in. So as you see, we need sustained readability. Sustained readability becomes an issue when you have this type of fancy font throughout. And it's almost impossible for anyone to read pages and pages of text in this kind of font without getting eye strain and without your brain being like, okay, that's just way too much for me to deal with. So fonts like Times New Roman or Arial are more appropriate choices for body text because they're comfortable to read. They're easy to read. It's not such a strain on the eye, and your brain is more used to seeing that type of text. So in this here, we have to also consider text in the web. It's important to know how the web differs from print. First of all, fonts are handled differently between the two. Print and print-based documents are static. And excuse me. And when designers create and print a document, there are no surprises with the appearance. Readers will see the document as it was designed, but on the web, browser configurations can impact how well a user will see or not see a text. Designers need to take into account that different users have different configurations and they need to accommodate those various users. So not all faces are visible in every browser, right? Not all fonts. And screen size and resolution can alter the appearance of text on the web. In some cases, the alignment of the text is seriously affected, or users will see a string of boxes and nonsense characters if it's not an acceptable type of font. So it's best to stick with HTML standard fonts such as Times New Roman, Arial, Verdana, and so forth. You can specify more generically sans serif or serif, allowing the web document to be seen with a comment font in the user's machine. So it really depends on how the audience, the user, that is the consumer of that content that you put out there, how their browsers are configured. So finally, the issue of screen readability. While some fonts look great in print, those same fonts might look awful on the web, right? Fonts that resemble handwritten script can be really difficult to read, regardless of user compatibility or not. So you need to be sure to view your web text in more than one browser and on more than one screen. I'm going to pause here for a second. So that's text in the web. You really need to be mindful of how things look. So let's talk about color next. We're only going to cover the very basics of color, but keep in mind that there are a wealth of resources about color in books and on the web, some which cover some really cool theoretical perspectives, but we'll just devote our primary consideration to contrast relating to color. So contrast deals with the brightness of one color in relation to another color, and it's one of the most basic and critical choices a designer can make about color. The most extreme example of contrast occurs on the printed page with black text and white paper. The contrast between black text and white paper increases legibility, meaning it's more easily read, and making it the most commonly used combination. Well, let's take a look at the next slide. Reversing the color scheme to white text on black background may pose some problems when you're designing on the screen. On some monitors, white can be almost blinding or may not be as visually appealing. So it's best to stick with conservative choices when you're designing for the screen. One example is to run black text over a neutral light color like beige or mint green. Also, you have to think about computer screens because they're made up of pixels, which are little boxes of light, and each pixel contains a red element, a green element, and a blue element, known as RGB. I'm sure you people all know this better than I do. So the combination of colors that designers use might not always look best on screen because of those RGB values. So let's take a look at a few examples that will illustrate this idea. But first I want to say, as a designer, you need to consider the difference between saturated versus muted colors when choosing color combinations. Saturation is how much color is there. And then if you think back when you were a child and you played with those little palettes of watercolors, when you really scrubbed your brush into the paint and you picked up more color, you produced a full saturated color when the brush hit the paper. But on the opposite end, if you watered it down a lot and you just picked up a little paint, the result, of course, was more faint. So finally, you also need to think about the cultural associations for various colors. For example, red is culturally coded to jar us, right? It's a shocking color. It can represent danger, excitement, revolution, so on and so forth. So think about where red is used. Red lights, stop signs, flags, warning labels, bullfights. Red is not always the best choice because of those associations. So it's important to think about what particular color represents and to choose accordingly. So let's take a look here. We look at this bright red background and deep blue text. It's really hard to read, right? The contrast is low, which makes that text difficult to see and to read. Also, you remember that pixels each contain that RGB value, and you'll see that the red element of the red areas of the screen full on. However, the blue element, and then there's like this black hole on the left and a glow to the right. It really does weird stuff to your eyes. You can't look at it very long, right? The second example uses a darker red for a background and a desaturated blue color. There's higher contrast, so the text is easier to read. Also, the darker red does not have the same cultural associations as that first bright red. So you see that kind of difference between saturation and color contrast. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. I'm going to skip over clip art because I think clip art is just really cheesy, and I hope that you don't use it. It's just my personal opinion. So we'll talk about illustrations and diagrams. And in the upcoming weeks, we will be doing some work regarding copyright and fair use. But I want to talk about visuals as far as illustrations and diagrams to help with some of your information. They can enhance or they can ruin a design, but unlike clip art, which is usually just accents, you know, and don't really have much of a purpose, illustrations and diagrams can serve a central purpose to inform. They can and should convey specific information that relates to the overall information of your document. So if you're using an illustration or a diagram, it's having a purpose, right? You're not just putting it there because. It has a purpose for your project. So you should be thinking about and striving for clarity in your illustrations and diagrams and to avoid clutter of too much information. So, for example, a map of the United States does not include representations of every office building, house, or grocery store between New York City and Los Angeles. However, it does have selective pictures of reality so that users can focus on what is most important in the map, which of course is the roads. It's also important to break up large amounts of complex information into manageable pieces. And you as a designer can break up information visually, or you can do it spatially. So a good example, it would be a road atlas of the United States. It's in book format where every state gets its own page or pages. It would be impractical, difficult to use, and hard to read if the atlas was simply one gigantic map that you had to then fold up. That would just be ridiculous, right? So we make it manageable by piecing it out into manageable chunks, right? So we have visuals that will inform and have visual clarity so you're not cluttering, and it just does something for your audience's eye. Then we can talk about graphs. So it's becoming really easy to design graphs to represent information, especially for programs like Microsoft Excel. And you can, if you're doing PowerPoint, there are a lot of great aspects that kind of import things from Excel. So it's really very cool and exciting. And you can create different types of graphs and control color or scale. However, keep in mind that not all graphs are alike, and you need to choose how to represent qualitative information based on the type of data and the purpose of the graph. So for example, pie charts are common and easy to generate. However, they're only helpful in showing parts of a whole. So if your figures are not in percentages, pie charts are not really going to be the best representation of your data. If you want to demonstrate changes over time, a single pie chart would be useless. You have to use several pie charts. So in that case, bar graphs are more helpful for comparisons between different numeric variables over time. And lastly, you have the option of using line graphs, especially if you're plotting changes in one variable over time. Line graphs can be really helpful when working with small time segments. And when multiple colors are used, several variables can be plotted. It's important to remember that using too many lines and plotting too many variables can be confusing to the reader. So a bar graph might be a better choice in that kind of situation. But graphs are cool. And of course, photographs. We have found images versus captured photographs. And again, this all comes in consideration of copyright, fair use, that kind of thing. And of course, you know, with our technology that's forever ever changing, we have, you know, digital cameras, phones, scanners, and other imaging devices that make it really easy for us to incorporate photographs now. However, as a beginning designer, you may still choose to find images on the web rather than, you know, creating and capturing your own images. And the concern there is with found images, you need to really be cognizant of copyright issues. And we will talk more about this in the upcoming weeks. Second and most important from a design standpoint is the issue of composition and quality. Again, the issue of ethos comes up. The designers want to use images with the best quality and the best clarity. Otherwise, when the image is reproduced on the screen or on the paper, it could be fuzzy or grainy, which takes away from the overall design of the project. You want your images to have impact. So using fuzzy or grainy pictures really kind of undercuts your ethos, your credibility as a designer and as somebody presenting a project, right? So another thing to think about is when you're using those found images from the internet is the appropriateness of the image to your overall design and the content of your project. It's easy to find a photograph that may highlight a particular theme or idea, but depending on the composition and subject matter of the photo, it may or may not fit with your overall design. Thus, it is often best to capture your own image when possible. The last thing, you should think about the effects you're achieving with the photographs. When using photographs, it's important to consider what the image conveys and whether the photo includes anything inappropriate or unnecessary. You can manipulate images, cropping it to exclude certain parts, removing clutter, adding filters. You can even manipulate the color, all to achieve a certain effect and to emphasize the subject matter of the photograph. So some design considerations overall, you want to create paths for the eye. So that includes your text and your color and your images. In visual design, it's important to consider all of the factors and how they all come together. Creating visual and multimedia projects is similar to writing a traditional essay or research paper. The complete product does not exist perfectly in your mind. Instead, the best ideas come from your interaction with those ideas on paper or in a word processor or a design program. So sometimes what seems like a great idea isn't when you actually implement it and see the result. So there are some basic guides that can help you to realize your visual design ideas. So the first is to create paths for the eye. And this really comes from art appreciation. So for example, if you're creating a poster for a club call out, or you're doing it for this project with the sea of posters on campus, you need to think about an eye-catching design, either with a striking image or a small amount of text in large font. Certainly you can generate the poster with this design idea, keeping in mind the issues of font choice and image quality. And that link that I provided in week 11 really is helpful as far as designing posters, but you can also take those design ideas and apply it to something that you're presenting on the web. So if the rhetorical purpose of the poster is to inform students about particulars, then you need to also consider how the information is arranged on the poster. You don't want all the text for the meeting details to be lumped onto the page. Instead, you must create a path for the eye to follow, aligning the text so that your audience can easily pick out and find the information quickly. So if you think back where we did that exercise, I think it was a journal exercise, analyzing the multimodal advertisement for whooping cough that the CDC did, you will notice that if you take a look again, I'm not going to call it up, but you will take a look again, you will notice that the line of the ad is actually almost a diagonal from the top right to the bottom left, and the eye travels from the top down to where that yellow rubber duck's mouth is open like this, and then you see the text that the CDC really wants you to see. So it draws the eye down to where that most important information is. And it's a really subtle thing, but it is really quite genius in design. So I recommend that you take a look at that again and just see how your eye travels across the page and how it actually is directed by that very purposeful, blurry rubber duck in the corner of the left-hand page. It's very purposeful because the mouth opens up right to the text. So it's important to be consistent in your design. With the endless possibilities for font and color choices, it can be easy to get carried away and try to incorporate many different styles and choices, but rather than including everything plus the kitchen sink, you should work towards consistency in your design, making good rhetorical decisions about fonts, colors, and images. So, stepping back, to evaluate your design, you need to ask yourself several questions. Is your design clarifying your information or making it more confusing? Is your design unique enough to make it stand out from a pile of resumes, a stack of brochures, a wall full of posters? Is your design readable from its intended distance? You don't want to print posters as though they were business cards and vice versa. Have you tried to read it from 10 feet away, 20 feet, 50? This is more for posters. Have you checked the spelling and mechanics on everything? Of course, you want to be credible. So it's really important that you proofread and edit when you need to. And then lastly, thinking about designing for the web, how does it look on different browsers? On campus computers, on an old pre-Pentium computer, how long does it take the page to load? That kind of thing. It's always a good idea to get a second pair of eyes to critically examine your work, just like you do with your papers. And perhaps for this project, it's even better that you get somebody who's not really an academic per se, have your family members take a look at it and see what they think. Is this an effective thing? Is it eye-catching? Is it doing what it needs to do, right? Is it fulfilling its rhetorical purpose? Remember that just as no one is born brilliant and ready for press writer, design takes hard work and dedication as well. So here are a few books that can help with color and design. And that is that. That's the end of the presentation, so we'll stop sharing. So it's a lot of information to take in and a lot of things to think about, but I think if you're mindful of the types of fonts that you're using and the colors that you're choosing and the overall visual arrangement of material for your project, you're going to do really well. So just think about design and that kind of thing. And that is visual rhetoric. All right, take care. Bye-bye.